welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
So, welcome to the deep dive. I'm really excited about our mission today because we're going to completely deconstruct, one of history's most famous power couples.
Well, absolutely. The founders of a massive imperial dynasty, Liu Bang and Lü Zhi.
Right. And the thing is, if you've ever looked into them, you usually get this very pristine, gold-leafed historical artifacts handed down through the centuries.
But today, we are going to peel off that shiny label.
Yeah, we're taking a look at the incredibly messy duct tape machinery humming underneath. It's a fascinating case study in how power retroactively edits its own origins.
I mean, for anyone who has studied history, the official narrative is rarely the whole truth. But what we're looking at today goes way beyond just a simple omission of facts. We are talking about a systematic cover-up of a deeply uncomfortable reality.
Exactly. When you read the classical accounts, the union between Liu Bang and Lü Zhi is presented as, well, practically ordained by the heavens.
Like it was destiny. Right. It's framed as this tale of profound foresight and mystical auras. This grand destiny bringing a brilliant empress and a legendary emperor together to, reshape civilization.
But then you apply a critical lens to the actual logistics, right? How their partnership actually began. And the mythological romance just completely evaporates.
It really does. What you are left with resembles a calculated, high-stakes venture capital investment, complete with a hostile corporate takeover of an existing household.
It's wild. I want you, the listener, to really keep that image in your head as we walk through this. Imagine reading this historical text telling you these two people were drawn together by divine providence.
And then you look closer at the timeline
Right.
and the surviving legal records.
Yeah, and you realize there was already someone else living in the house when this divine union took place. Someone who was just quietly and brutally pushed out of the narrative.
And then covered up by later historians using incredibly dense bureaucratic jargon.
Exactly. That is the true story we're unpacking today. Right. The gritty, calculated, and often really awkward reality of how imperial power is actually built.
So I think the most logical place to begin this deconstruction is with the marriage itself.
Yeah, let's look at the raw facts of the arrangement between Liu Gong, the father of the bride, and Liu Bang, because it completely defies every single social convention of that era.
Defies is an understatement. I mean, it actively spits in the face of how a respectable family was supposed to operate.
Right, let's set the stage for how a standard, acceptable marriage was supposed to work back then in pre-imperial and early imperial times. It was a deeply formalized process.
Highly mediated, yes. A family didn't just casually decide to marry off a daughter.
No, you had to employ a matchmaker. You had to enter into extensive negotiations with the parents of the groom.
The families would compare ancestral lines, negotiate the exchange of wealth, and ensure both sides were of relatively equal social standing.
And that matched status wasn't just like a nice preference to have. It was the absolute foundation of the entire social order.
That parity was essential for social stability. A marriage was a public declaration of a family's worth.
So if a family bypassed those conventions, if they went around the matchmaker or ignored the groom's parents, that was highly suspicious.
Oh, it was an outright scandal. It suggested desperation or maybe a severe breakdown in familial authority.
Yet, when we look at the historical record, Liu Gong completely sidesteps this entire apparatus.
He doesn't consult a matchmaker at all.
He makes no attempt to negotiate with Liu Taigong or Liu Ao, who were the parents of Liu Bang.
Right. He essentially just approaches Liu Bang directly and offers his daughter Lü Zhi.
Which is, the ancient equivalent of walking up to a guy on the street, bypassing all social etiquette, and just saying, hey, let's merge our lives right now.
It's bizarre. Now, the traditional narrative tries to frame the Liu family as this prominent, highly respected clan in their local region, like they're supposed to be local elites.
But if a wealthy, high-status family suddenly marries their daughter off in this really irregular, almost clandestine way to a man vastly below their station, that should trigger a massive local scandal.
Absolutely. The gossips in the village should have had a field day. We should see records of the family being ostracized.
Right, criticized by their peers for lowering themselves. But we don't see that scandal recorded anywhere.
We don't, which really forces us to question the foundational premise of their supposed elite status.
That social disparity between the Liu family and Liu Bang has been like a cornerstone of the official history for centuries. But let's actually look critically at the groom here.
Right. At this time, Liu Bang was a low-level local official. Specifically, he was a tingzang, which means a pavilion chief.
And that's not exactly a glamorous magistrate position.
Not at all. A pavilion chief was a minor functionary. He was responsible for maintaining local order, maybe managing a small postal relay station, and chasing down local bandits.
He was basically a rough-around-the-edges beat cop. He had a meager salary.
I'm glad you brought up his actual job, because official sounds a lot grander to modern ears than the reality of what he was doing.
Yeah, he wasn't sitting in a gilded hall debating philosophy. He was in the dirt, dealing with local disputes.
And frankly, he was known for being a bit of a rogue. He liked to drink, he accrued debts at the local taverns, he flouted conventions.
Right, he is not the kind of man a supposedly prestigious wealthy family looks at and says, yes, this is the ideal son-in-law to elevate our bloodline.
That contrast becomes even sharper when we examine the other major marriage arranged by Liu Gong, because he had two daughters.
Right, he married the elder, Lü Zhi, to this minor pavilion chief, but then he married his younger daughter, Liu Shu, to a man named Fan Kuai.
And this is the detail that completely shatters the illusion for me, because Fan Kuai was not a scholar. He was not a rising political star.
The man was a dog meat butcher.
Literally, he spent his days slaughtering animals and selling meat in the local market.
And the occupation of a butcher occupied an even lower social tier than a minor official, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was manual, bloody labor, entirely removed from the prestige of the educated or landowning classes.
So we really have to look at this holistically. A supposedly elite father takes his only two daughters and marries them off to a low-level beat cop who drinks too much, and a man hacking up dog meat in the marketplace.
It's quite a picture.
I just have a really hard time reconciling that with the idea of the Liu family being prestigious. I mean, think about it. If a modern billionaire married their kids to a toll booth operator and a guy running a hot dog stand, you wouldn't think they were operating from a position of massive wealth.
No, you would deduce that the family was either completely bankrupt and lying about their status, or they were playing an angle that nobody else could see.
Exactly. And the logical conclusion is that the social gulf between the Liu family and these men was a later fabrication.
The Lü family, at the time these marriages took place, could not possibly have possessed high rank or substantial wealth. And the evidence of their daily lives post-marriage really supports this.
Right. Because when Liu Zhi married Liu Bang, she didn't exactly move into a sprawling estate.
No, she didn't have an entourage of servants. The historical texts explicitly describe her laboring in the agricultural fields alongside her two young children.
Pulling weeds and managing crops just to survive. She lived the grueling life of a peasant woman.
They were at the very bottom of the ladder, grinding it out.
But that reality creates a massive structural problem for the historians later, doesn't it?
A huge problem. Because once Liu Bang and Liu Zhi successfully overthrew the existing order and established themselves as the emperor and empress, they had a major PR crisis.
Right. They needed to legitimize their rule to millions of people. You can't exactly issue an imperial decree that says, hey, we were a couple of broke farmers and a butcher who managed to win a bloody war.
That really doesn't inspire awe. It certainly doesn't project the mandate of heaven.
So they needed a narrative that explained away this incredibly humble, almost embarrassing matchmaking.
And the solution they devised was highly effective and deeply rooted in the cultural psychology of the time. They essentially injected magic into the historical record.
It's the ultimate spin. It wasn't a marriage born out of poverty and a lack of better options. It was destiny.
Let's break down how they actually executed this historical retcon. The narrative that was actively constructed and circulated later was that Liu Gong possessed a supernatural ability.
For physiognomy, right? Face reading.
Yes. In ancient Chinese culture, face reading wasn't just a parlor trick. It was viewed as a sophisticated pseudoscience. The belief was that a person's fate, their character, and their connection to heaven were physically manifested in their facial structure.
And their aura.
Right. So the story inserted into the official histories claims that Liu Gong could look at a person and literally perceive the physical markers of profound future greatness.
So the official story becomes, Liu Gong isn't a desperate father marrying his daughter to a local rogue. He's a prophetic sage.
Exactly. He looks at this broke bureaucrat and this dog meat butcher, and through his mystical laser vision, he sees the glowing aura of a future founding emperor and a mighty imperial general.
It is a brilliant piece of retroactive justification. It elegantly neutralizes all those awkward questions about why a family would bypass matchmakers and marry into the lowest tiers of society.
It reframes a marriage of low-status networking into a story of profound, almost divine insight.
I definitely see the utility in it for Liu Bang. It elevates him from a commoner to a heaven-ordained hero. So it's basically ancient political PR. They're writing themselves into history as like King Arthur and Merlin or Jesus and John the Baptist.
That's a great analogy, but I think this piece of PR does something far more valuable for Empress Liu and her family.
Oh, for sure. Because when we look at the timeline of when these stories likely gained the most traction, it coincides perfectly with Empress Liu's own consolidation of power.
You're touching on the underlying political machinery of the myth here. When Empress Liu eventually seized unprecedented power later in life, ruling as a de facto sovereign, she actively promoted these legitimacy myths.
So this wasn't just about her husband anymore.
No, by amplifying the story of her father's magical face reading, she is systematically elevating her own bloodline. The Liu clan is no longer remembered as a family of modest means scraping by.
Right. They're transformed into a lineage of prophetic sages. They become a family inherently worthy of imperial kinship, capable of divining the will of heaven.
It provided her with a crucial ideological foundation to justify her own absolute authority.
But let's strip the magic away entirely for a second. Because as fascinating as the PR strategy is, we know Liu Gong didn't actually possess glowing aura vision.
We can safely assume that, yes.
And if we accept the reality that the family was not top-tier nobility, we're still left with a core mystery. Why did Liu Gong pick Liu Bang?
Because even a family of modest means doesn't just hand over a daughter without a reason. There has to be a strategic goal.
Right. And that brings us to a historical theory that is way more grounded and, frankly, much more compelling than any supernatural explanation.
The venture capitalist theory.
Yes. The theory that Liu Gong was operating with the mindset of a venture capitalist, playing a very specific, high-stakes political game.
He was not acting like a traditional father seeking a safe, comfortable domestic arrangement for his daughter. He was looking for an investment vehicle.
The idea of an ancient venture capitalist is wild to me. But let's walk through the mechanics of this, because it completely recontextualizes the entire marriage. What evidence points to this kind of strategy?
Well, to understand this framework, we have to look at the geographical and historical breadcrumbs surrounding Liu Gong's origins. His hometown was a place called Shanfu.
And that's not just a random location on a map, is it?
No, it's not. Decades earlier, Shanfu had been a city located squarely within the extensive fiefdom of a man named Lü Bui.
Okay, now Lü Bui is a figure we really need to expand on because he is the ultimate archetype for this kind of behavior.
He was not a king, he was a merchant. But he used his wealth and his strategic mind to essentially buy a kingdom.
He is one of the most remarkable political operators in history. Tell us about him.
Well, he famously encountered a captive, exiled prince from the state of Qin. This prince was practically a hostage, entirely forgotten by his own family, but Liu Bui recognized his latent political potential.
So he invested in him.
Heavily. He invested his massive fortune into a complex, multi-year lobbying campaign to get this exiled prince installed as the heir apparent and eventually the king of Qin.
He treated statecraft entirely as a business investment. Didn't he have a famous conversation with his father about this?
He did. He famously asked his father, "What is the profit on investing in a man who becomes a king?" And the answer, of course, was that the profit is incalculable.
He literally orchestrated a startup monarchy. That is incredible. Now, I know some historians have floated a very controversial theory about the connection between this legendary merchant and the father of our empress.
Yes, there is a speculative theory advanced by certain scholars proposing a direct link. They note the shared surname, the overlapping geography of Shanfu, and the identical political methodologies.
So they think they're related.
Some have conjectured that Liu Gong belonged to Lü Bui's wider clan. There is even a more extreme proposition suggesting Liu Gong might have been Liu Bui's unrecorded biological son.
Hiding out after Liu Bui fell from power.
Exactly, since Lü Bui was eventually forced to commit suicide.
I gotta push back on the biological son theory, though. Claiming a direct, secret DNA link between the most famous political mastermind of the previous generation and the father of the new empress. That feels like a massive historical leap.
It does feel a bit too neat, doesn't it?
Yeah, almost like a separate piece of historical fiction trying to tie two separate eras together.
It is entirely fair to be skeptical of the biological claim. Without definitive genealogical records, it remains highly speculative. However, the exact genetic lineage is almost secondary to the behavioral pattern.
Right. Even if we throw out the DNA test, the strategy is exactly the same.
It's a perfect mirror of Liu Gui's playbook. Liu Gong surveys his environment. He sees the brutal, oppressive reality of the Qin regime. He senses the widespread anger and the fragility of the current order.
And then he looks at Liu Bang.
And he sees a man who is poor, yes, but who possesses immense charisma, street smarts, and a natural ability to command the loyalty of the rugged men in their district. Liu Gong recognizes a rare, high-potential human asset.
He sees the perfect founder for a rebellion startup.
Precisely. Liu Bang has the charisma to rally the troops, but he lacks the capital and the organizational backing, so Liu Gong makes the investment.
He deploys whatever remaining wealth his family has.
He activates their social networks, and he channels their deep-seated grievances against the government into backing this nascent rebellion. And he uses the marriage of his daughter, Lü Zhi, not as an act of familial affection, but as the ironclad contract that cements the alliance.
And it is crucial to note that this was an active operational investment. They didn't just give Liu Bang a dowry and retreat to the countryside to see how the war turned out.
The integration was total. The Liu clan committed all their human capital to the enterprise. Liu Gong's two sons, Lü Zhi and Lü Zhi, didn't just stay behind.
They became generals, right?
Yes, capable, high-ranking generals leading troops in Liu Bang's army. And remember Fan Kuai, the dog meat butcher who married the younger sister?
The hot dog vendor from earlier.
Right. He transforms from a guy chopping meat in the market to one of the most legendary warriors of the era. He becomes Liu Bang's most ferocious, loyal bodyguard and vanguard general.
Fighting beside him in countless life-or-death engagements, the family was entirely leveraged on this single outcome.
But the most vital operational asset they provided wasn't the brothers or the butcher. It was Lü Zhi herself.
This is where the narrative usually fails her. We often picture the Empress as someone who just endures the hardship in the background, waiting for her husband to conquer the world so she can step into the palace.
But her role was incredibly active.
She was foundational, wasn't she?
Absolutely. If we operate on the premise that the Lai family retain a sophisticated political perspective, perhaps the lingering intellectual heritage of a lineage like Liu Bui's, then Lü Zhi's value was immeasurable.
What did she actually do?
She functioned as a high-level political tutor. The historical accounts strongly suggest she imparted critical statecraft to Liu Bang. She wasn't just a supportive spouse, she was breaking down the mechanics of empire for a man who had only ever managed a local postal station.
What kind of intelligence are we talking about here? How do you teach a beat cop to be an emperor?
You teach him the scale of what he is trying to conquer. She reportedly described the sheer architectural grandeur and layout of the capital palaces in Xianyang.
So he could visualize the target.
Right, and she explained the rigorous, terrifyingly complex bureaucratic and legal order of the Qin Empire. The Qin Dynasty was founded on legalism, a philosophy of strict laws, harsh punishments, and absolute centralization.
She had to explain how that machinery actually worked.
Exactly. She detailed the extraordinary, relentless work ethic of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, so Liu Bang understood the caliber of the institution he was trying to dismantle.
That is some high-level tutoring.
Furthermore, she acted as an intelligence hub, keeping him informed about the various underground resistance networks that other members of her clan were busily organizing across different regions.
She is essentially the chief operating officer of the rebellion. She handles the organizational architecture while he handles the frontline leadership.
It is a brilliant division of labor.
But it completely shatters our modern, romanticized view of what their marriage was. Because when you frame it as a venture capital investment and a corporate merger, you remove the one thing we assume is at the core of a marriage.
Love.
Right, love.
Our modern expectations of marriage are the biggest barrier to accurately understanding historical figures. We look at a husband and wife in the ancient world, and we project our own values onto them.
We want to see romance.
We do. The modern concept of marriage, that it is fundamentally a partnership born of romantic love, that it strives for spousal parity, emotional fulfillment, and strict monogamy, is a very recent historical development.
In the context of the society we're discussing, that modern concept is entirely alien. It's an imported idea.
It really is.
I want to spend some time on this, because if they aren't marrying for love, what is the actual mechanism driving the institution of marriage during this period? How did an ancient family view the purpose of a wedding?
From the pre-imperial era stretching all the way through late imperial times, marriage was almost exclusively a utilitarian institution. It was a societal tool built to ensure survival and continuity, resting on three immovable pillars.
Let's break those down. What's the first pillar?
Alliance building. A marriage was the primary mechanism for binding two distinct clans together through a mutual exchange of resources.
Like we saw with the Liu family.
Exactly. It was a contract of shared advancement and mutual defense. You marry your daughter to my son, and our families pool our wealth, our political connections, and our physical security.
So their bond is literally that of political allies.
Yes,
It's pure networking. You are expanding your corporate footprint.
that's a perfect way to put it. The second pillar is the securing of heirs, and the importance of this cannot be overstated. We have to understand the profound religious and cultural weight of filial piety.
Right, because society operated on a system of ancestral worship.
Yes. The belief was that your deceased ancestors required continuous sacrifices, food, incense, reverence, to exist comfortably in the afterlife.
If a family line died out.
Those ancestors became hungry, neglected ghosts. Therefore, of all the forms of unfilial conduct a person could commit, childlessness was considered the absolute gravest sin.
Marriage was the legally sanctioned factory for producing legitimate heirs to guarantee that ancestral continuity.
Yes.
The pressure must have been suffocating. It wasn't just about wanting a family. It was about preventing the spiritual starvation of your entire lineage.
It was a monumental duty. And the third pillar was economic survival in old age.
Because there were no state pensions.
No social security nets and no retirement communities. A person's survival when they became too old to work in the fields or serve in the government depended entirely on their children.
Sons specifically, right?
Yes, sons bore the primary, absolute, and legally enforceable responsibility for sheltering and feeding their aging parents.
So this grim economic reality was the primary engine driving the culture's deep-rooted preference for male children.
You married to produce the sons who would literally keep you from starving to death in your later years.
Wow. When you lay it out like that, alliance building, spiritual duty to ancestors, and literally avoiding starvation, the idea of marrying someone because they make you laugh or because you feel a spark seems almost childish in that context.
Romantic love was a luxury. If affection happened to develop between a husband and wife over years of shared life, that was considered a pleasant bonus. But it was not the foundational purpose, and its absence did not invalidate the marriage.
So when we apply this to Liu Bang and Lü Zhi,
We see two grassroots partners who entered into a highly pragmatic alliance. They were both formidable, fiercely intelligent, and unconstrained individuals.
they spent the early years of their marriage navigating immense hardship, hiding from authorities, and fighting a brutal, bloody war.
Their ethical standards were dictated by survival, falling well below the polished, ceremonial norms of the high aristocracy.
Their bond was forged in trauma. It's a family-run enterprise that accidentally scales into an imperial dynasty. They're co-founders who built an empire in the mud and the blood.
That is a very accurate description. It was solidarity forged through joint struggle. But a bond based purely on political alignment and shared trauma lacks the primal emotional anchor of genuine affection.
Right. But without that primal romantic foundation, isn't that a ticking time bomb for future political drama?
Oh, absolutely. If the only thing holding your partnership together is the shared struggle against a mutual enemy, in this case, the Qin dynasty, what happens when you win?
Once the business succeeds, the enemy is dead, and you are sitting on the throne, the unifying goal is gone.
It was a ticking time bomb, and the explosion was spectacular. The absence of fundamental trust and mutual affection became a catastrophic liability later in their lives.
What happened?
Once the throne was relatively secure, the paranoia set in. The later years of Liu Bang's reign, and particularly the period immediately following his death when Empress Liu took control, were defined by horrific political purges, betrayals, and violence within the inner court.
The corporate merger ultimately resulted in a ruthless struggle for absolute control of the board.
Which makes perfect sense when you view it as a transaction rather than a romance.
And viewing it as a purely calculated political merger also solves the initial mystery we started with. We asked why Liu Gong didn't bother using a matchmaker to talk to Liu Bang's parents.
Right. If this was a corporate merger, he didn't need to talk to the parents, because the company he was acquiring was already an independent entity.
That is such a crucial legal distinction.
It is. The assumption that Liu Gong had to consult Liu Bang's father, Liu Taigong, is based on a generalized view of patriarchal authority. But we have to look at the specific household laws enacted by the Qin regime at that precise moment in history.
What did the laws say?
Under the Qin system, which was designed to maximize taxation and military conscription, adult males were strongly encouraged and sometimes legally required to separate from their birth families and establish their own independent households.
Ah, I see. Because if you have 3 adult sons living under one roof, the government can only tax that one household.
Precisely. But if you force the sons to move out and start their own farms, suddenly you have 4 households to tax.
It's a pure revenue play by the state.
The Qin state actively dismantled large, multi-generational clan living arrangements to increase their revenue base. Consequently, Liu Bang had already separated from his parents.
He was legally registered as the head of his own independent household. He was entirely his own master, liable for his own taxes and his own legal conduct.
Therefore, when Liu Gong initiated his venture capital negotiation, he went directly to the sole proprietor of the enterprise.
That makes logical sense, but it brings us to a massive, incredibly frustrating historical riddle. We know Liu Bang was an independent adult, but how old was he exactly when Liu Gong showed up at his door?
Yes, the historical records are remarkably, almost suspiciously vague on this point.
The timeline of Liu Bang's life is one of the great unresolved debates among historians, isn't it?
It is. The most authoritative early texts, including the monumental work by the grand historian Sima Qian, inexplicably fail to record the year of Liu Bang's birth.
For the founding emperor of a dynasty that lasted 4 centuries, that is a staggering omission.
Because of this silence in the primary texts, later scholars attempted to retroactively calculate his age, leaving us with 2 entirely different competing chronologies.
Let's lay out the 2 timelines and explore the implications, because a decade of difference fundamentally alters how we view his psychology and his place in history. What's the first timeline?
The first timeline originates from a scholar named Huang Fu-mi, who lived several centuries later. He asserted that Liu Bang was born in the year 256 BCE and that he died in 195 BCE.
Which would mean he lived to be 62 years old?
Correct.
Okay, 62. That feels like a solid, respectable age for an ancient conqueror. And what is the alternative?
The alternative chronology is derived from another historical account, which states that Liu Bang was elevated to the rank of a king at the age of 42, that he reigned in that capacity for a further 12 years, and that he died at the age of 53.
So the anchor point here is his death.
Yes, the year 195 BCE is undisputed. There are too many corroborating records of his passing. So if we accept that he died at 53 in 195 BCE, we do the math backward, which gives us a birth year of 247 BCE.
So we have a 9-year discrepancy. He is either born in 256 or 247. Now, on the surface, arguing about a 9-year gap thousands of years ago seems like academic nitpicking. Why does this specific age difference matter so intensely?
It matters profoundly because of who he was fighting. It changes his temporal relationship to the first emperor, the Qin Huang.
Oh, I see.
If we accept the first timeline, that Liu Bang lived to 62, it means he was born only 3 years after the Qin Huang. It makes the 2 men near-exact contemporaries.
It sets them up as a generational mirror image of each other. 2 titans born in the same era, shaped by the same sweeping historical forces, ultimately colliding to decide the fate of the civilization. It feels incredibly cinematic.
It possesses a tremendous narrative symmetry, which is likely why it became the more popular and widely accepted timeline in later centuries. It feels narratively satisfying.
But is it accurate?
Historians have pointed out a significant flaw in this version. The scholar who proposed it, Huang Fu-mi, had a notorious reputation for stating numerical claims and exact dates without providing rigorous evidence to back them up. His chronology is often viewed with deep suspicion by modern analysts.
Right. And if we look at the younger timeline, that he died at 53, it means he was 12 years younger than the first emperor.
Correct. And to many historians who study the granular details of his early career, his behavior as a local rogue, his physical stamina during the grueling years of constant warfare, a younger age feels much more plausible.
A man in his late 30s or early 40s leading frontline cavalry charges definitely aligns better with the physical realities of ancient combat than a man entering his late 50s.
Exactly.
But let me play devil's advocate here. We can debate the math all day, but does it actually change the fundamental dynamic of the marriage we are discussing? Whether he was 35 or 44 when the rebellion started, he was a fully grown man.
You have hit upon the central truth. The exact integer of his age is less important than his developmental stage. Whichever timeline you subscribe to, the inescapable conclusion is that when Liu Gong arrived with a marriage proposal, Liu Bang was an established, mature adult.
He'd been living independently, heading his own household, and operating with it as a local community for years, if not decades.
Yes.
And this is where I want the listener to really put themselves in his shoes. Think about how independent you are right now. Think about what it means to be an established adult. If you're 35 or 40 years old, living independently, paying your own taxes, working a job, you are not a blank slate.
You have a history.
You have routines, and crucially, you have relationships. The idea that a man of his charisma and age would have a completely empty, pristine house just waiting for a venture capitalist to drop off a bride is absurd.
Which raises a massive red flag about this sudden marriage proposal, doesn't it?
It really does. Which brings us to the massive, glaring oversight in Liu Gong's strategy.
It is the ultimate failure of due diligence in a corporate merger. If Liu Gong was acting as a prudent political investor, the absolute first question he should have investigated before finalizing the alliance was whether Liu Bang's household was actually vacant.
Right. He needed to verify if there were any pre-existing encumbrances on the asset he was investing in.
Because you cannot smoothly merge your company with a new CEO if someone else already owns a controlling stake in the headquarters.
So Liu Gong shows up to formally propose this political alliance, to finalize the deal. He opens the door to Liu Bang's independent household, and what exactly does he find?
He discovers that the house is already occupied.
A bombshell.
Liu Bang already had a long-term female companion. Her name was Lady Cao. And the complication was not merely romantic, it was physical. They already had a child together, a son named Liu Fei.
That is the awkward, suppressed secret of this entire historical narrative. The future founding emperor of the great dynasty, the man receiving this supposedly heaven-ordained bride, already had a family living in his house.
The existence of this family is an undeniable historical fact. Even the highly sanitized official histories could not erase it completely. Sima Qian's monumental record explicitly lists Liu Fei as Liu Bang's eldest son, noting that he was born to a non-principal wife.
I just want to linger on the sheer unbearable awkwardness of this collision. Imagine this scene. You have Liu Gong, armed with his family's wealth and his grand strategic vision, marching into this humble pavilion chief's home to offer his daughter's hand.
And there's Lady Cao.
Likely holding a toddler. What exactly was the nature of her relationship with Liu Bang? Was she a secret mistress? Was this an illicit affair hidden from the village?
No, there was nothing secretive about it. It was an informal, consensual union that was entirely visible to their local community.
So everyone knew.
We must discard the rigid aristocratic notions of formal betrothal when looking at the common people of this era. In the turbulent years prior to the empire's unification, the sprawling, expensive, multi-stage rituals of a formal wedding, the matchmakers, the elaborate bride prices, the heavily documented ceremonies were often simply unattainable for the lower classes.
Because if you're barely surviving on a minor official salary, you're working as a farmer, you can't afford a massive ceremonial exchange of wealth.
Exactly. For ordinary people, and particularly for someone with Liu Bang's famously unconstrained, freewheeling temperament, cohabitation was often enough.
They lived together.
They shared a life. They produced a son whom Liu Bang clearly cherished and recognized. They simply had not engaged in the elite bureaucratic rituals that legally codified a marriage under the strictest interpretations of the law.
So they were basically in a common law marriage. They were partners in every practical sense. But that lack of formal paperwork creates an incredibly dangerous vulnerability for Lady Cao the moment Liu Gong walks through the door.
Because Liu Gong isn't there to honor their domestic bliss. He is there to execute a political takeover.
Hold on. So the VC investor shows up to merge companies and discovers there's already an unrecorded co-founder living in the headquarters. How does the Liu family just steamroll over her?
They steamroll her because of power dynamics. The collision of these two realities is brutal. Liu Gong is offering resources, strategic intelligence, and the military backing of his sons. He is offering the capital needed to survive and conquer.
And Lady Cao possesses none of these assets.
She has no powerful father to negotiate terms. She has no brothers commanding troops. She has only her informal status and her son. When the alliance is struck, there is absolutely no question of how the power dynamics will resolve.
The Liu family would never permit their daughter, the linchpin of their grand strategy, to occupy a secondary position to a woman from an undocumented union.
It was a complete ruthless displacement. Liu Zhi walks in, backed by her family's wealth and ambition, and assumes the role of the principal wife.
Lady Cao is effectively demoted in her own home.
It is a stark demonstration of how power operates at the ground level.
But the really fascinating part is how later historians desperately tried to clean up the paperwork, isn't it?
Yes, what elevates this from a tragic domestic drama into a fascinating study of historical manipulation is how the later historians dealt with the fallout. They had to somehow integrate this displaced woman into the official record without destroying the dignity of the founding emperor.
Right, because you can't just delete her from the archives. Her son, Liu Fei, grows up to be a very prominent figure. He is the emperor's eldest son. Everyone knows he exists.
So the scribes sitting in the imperial library decades later have to figure out what to call his mother.
They can't call her the primary wife because that belongs to the terrifying Empress Liu, but they can't call her a concubine either, can they?
Labeling her a concubine would be factually inaccurate based on the timeline. A concubine is a secondary partner brought into a household that already has a legally established primary wife.
But Lady Cao predated Liu Ji. She was there first.
And describing the situation accurately, admitting that the great heaven-ordained emperor lived for years in an informal, undocumented union like a commoner, was considered far too degrading for the imperial dignity. It clashed violently with the majestic PR narrative they had constructed.
So what is the bureaucratic spin? What label do they invent to cover up the mess?
The historians writing the later chronicles, texts that sought to standardize the history, assigned Lady Cao a highly specific, very peculiar title. They categorized her as Liu Bang's external consort.
An external consort. It sounds incredibly dignified.
It sounds formal and regulated.
But I'm guessing that title is a complete fabrication when applied to her. What did external consort actually mean in the context of that society?
To expose the absurdity of applying this label to Lady Cao, we have to examine how the term was legitimately used among the elite classes. An external consort was not a euphemism for a common law partner.
It was an explicit status marker, right?
Yes, it denoted extreme wealth and high social rank. It referred to a highly regulated practice where an elite gentleman maintained multiple, geographically distinct households.
I needed an example of how this actually worked in practice. Who gets to have an external consort?
There is a highly illustrative story preserved in a classical text detailing the lives of exemplary women. It involves a man named Bo Su and his primary wife, Nü Zong.
Okay, tell us about them.
Bo Su was a gentleman originating from the state of Song. He was appointed to a government post in the neighboring state of Wei, which required him to relocate for a period of 3 years.
So an extended government deployment.
Yes. His primary wife, Nü Zong, did not accompany him. She remained at their ancestral home in Song to fulfill her paramount domestic duty, which was caring for his aging mother.
Got it.
While Bo Su was living away in Wei, he took another woman as an external wife and established a completely separate secondary household for her in that state.
So he essentially has his main estate in his home country and a secondary estate in the country where he's working. Now, in almost any era of history, a husband setting up a second house with another woman while his wife is home taking care of his mother is going to cause a massive domestic explosion. How did Nü Zong react?
This is precisely why her story was recorded and celebrated by the deeply patriarchal scholars of the time. When Nü Zong was informed of this external household, she exhibited no anger or jealousy.
Wait, really?
Instead, she intensified her devotion to her mother-in-law. She actively sent polite, respectful greetings to her husband via traveling merchants, and astonishingly, she even dispatched gifts to this external wife.
She sent a care package to her husband's second household. I'm just trying to imagine the level of societal conditioning required to view that as the correct response.
Her own sister was appalled. Her sister urged her to leave the marriage, arguing that her husband's actions were a profound insult.
I'm with the sister on this one.
But Nü Zong rebuked her sister with a speech that perfectly encapsulates the rigid, legalistic mindset of the elite ritual code. She stated that a woman's cardinal virtues are absolute chastity, obedience, and single-minded submission to her husband's authority. She argued that abandoning these virtues over petty emotional jealousy was a moral failure.
It is a devastatingly clear picture of how absent romantic love was from these elite arrangements. It was purely about duty and hierarchy. But did she justify his actions legally?
She did, and this is the crux of the matter. Lü Zhi explicitly cited the ritual legal code. She said, ritual prescribes multiple female partners for men according to their station. 12 for the son of heaven, 9 for feudal lords, 3 for high-ranking officials, 2 for gentlemen.
Oh, wow.
My husband is a gentleman, therefore 2 women are exactly his due.
That is incredible. She's literally quoting the municipal zoning laws for marriages. He is a rank 4 gentleman, therefore he is allotted 2 households. It's a strictly enforced class-based allocation of partners.
Exactly. And from this, a remarkable historical anecdote, we can extract 2 vital conclusions about the reality of an external consort. First, maintaining an external household was an undeniable marker of elite status and significant wealth.
Because a man had to possess the formal rank of a gentleman or a high official to legally justify the arrangement, and he had to possess the wealth to maintain 2 separate estates.
Right.
Let's apply that back to Liu Bang when he was living with Lady Cao. He was a low-level beat cop. He was known for being broke and drinking on credit. He absolutely did not possess the elite aristocratic rank nor the financial resources to establish a sprawling multi-household estate based on high society ritual prescriptions.
It is a complete mismatch of social class. The label is entirely inappropriate for his economic reality at that time.
But the second conclusion we draw from the story of Liu Zhi is even more critical, isn't it?
Yes. The very terminology used, the word external, only possesses meaning if it is situated relative to something internal.
Oh, I see the logic trap. You cannot have an external secondary house if you don't already have an internal primary house.
Precisely. To legally possess an external consort, a man was fundamentally required to first have a formal, legally recognized primary wife residing in the main internal household. Only after that primary structure was established could he legally sanction a secondary household elsewhere.
And Liu Bang completely fails that test. He didn't have a primary wife. Lü Zhi wasn't in the picture yet. Lady Cao wasn't living in a secondary house across the country. She was living in his main house, sharing his daily life. She was his only partner.
Therefore, their relationship did not resemble the elite model of an external consort in any conceivable way.
It's like trying to force a modern corporate tax bracket onto 2 people who were just bartering chickens in the woods. They use a fancy elite label to hide the fact that she was just his common-law partner.
It was a bureaucratic compromise. The historians applied a high-status label to a low-status reality to sanitize the past. If we strip away the destiny and the later imperial glory and just look at the likely trajectory of their lives had the rebellion never happened.
Right, if he'd just remained a pavilion chief his whole life, what would have happened to Lady Cao and her son?
If history had taken a quieter path, once Liu Fei reached the age required for inclusion in the Qin household registers, the local bureaucracy would have almost certainly formalized the arrangement.
They would have eventually just recognized Lady Cao as his legitimate wife.
Yes, they would have simply registered the boy as Liu Bang's legitimate heir, and Liu Bang and Lady Cao would have been officially documented as a standard, unremarkable family unit.
They were just a normal working-class couple who hadn't filed their final paperwork.
Yeah.
But the literati invented this label because calling her an imperial concubine was inaccurate, and admitting the founding emperor lived in a premarital informal union was too embarrassing.
It sounded suitably dignified for an imperial chronicle. It reinforced the idea that she was inherently secondary to the eventual Empress Liu, and it successfully glossed over the messy, unrefined reality of Liu Bang's early existence. It protected the mythology.
But when we do the work of stripping all that bureaucratic terminology away, when we bypass the PR and the magical face reading, what is left is a profoundly human, frankly, heartbreaking image of Lady Cao.
The historical reality of her situation is incredibly bleak. When you cut through the jargon, Lady Cao emerges as a deeply vulnerable woman operating from a position of absolute weakness.
She lacked a powerful VC father or general brothers to advocate for her.
Because she lacked formal, documented marital status, she had no legal shield when the Liu family initiated their takeover. She did not have a wealthy venture capitalist father negotiating terms or protecting her interests. She had no politically connected brothers ready to mobilize military force to defend her position in the household.
She had absolutely zero leverage against a corporate merger.
None whatsoever. She was entirely defenseless against the machinery of ambition. She could only stand by and watch as the Liu clan descended upon her life.
She was forced to watch as Lü Zhi, wielding the power of her family's strategic investments and their relentless political drive, simply stepped into her home and assumed absolute precedence.
Lady Tao was effectively erased from the primary narrative of her own partner's life, relegated to a sanitized footnote in the imperial archives.
It is a chilling realization, and it brings this entire discussion full circle. We began this deep dive looking at the grand mythology, right? The magical auras, the prophetic foresight, the idea of a heaven-ordained union between an emperor and a brilliant empress.
And where we actually arrive by looking closely at the historical logistics is a narrative that is entirely grounded in calculated, ruthless ambition. It was a desperate political alliance that literally displaced a vulnerable, pre-existing family in order to execute a corporate merger.
Understanding this fundamentally changes how we view history. The ascension of a dynasty, the building of imperial power, is rarely, if ever, a matter of divine destiny or clean moral trajectories. It is constructed through the aggressive leveraging of resources. It requires networking, the pooling of wealth, and often the brutal management of human lives.
The mechanics of power are inherently messy and frequently cruel.
Which is exactly why we have to keep peeling the labels off these artifacts. Because underneath the polished, state-sanctioned PR of history, you find the real, uncomfortable human decisions that actually shape the world. It's never just destiny. It's leverage.
It is a fascinating, sobering look at the past.
And it leaves me with a massive, lingering what if to end on. Because so much of this came down to the sheer luck of resources and power dynamics. What if the circumstances had been perfectly inverted? What if Lady Tao, the common law partner already living in the house, had been the one with the wealthy, politically connected venture capitalist father and the brothers who were generals?
That is a fascinating thought experiment.
And what if Liu Zhi had simply been a vulnerable commoner who knocked on the door with no leverage? How would the entire trajectory of this massive imperial dynasty have shifted? Would the ruthless, brilliant Empress Liu have just been an obscure, forgotten casualty of history? Would we even know the name Liu today? Something to chew on until next time. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.